From the nation's capital, the American Enterprise Institute for Public Policy Research presents Public Policy Forums, a series of programs featuring the nation's top authorities presenting their differing views on the vital issues which confront us. Today's topic, the U.S. Navy. What is its future?
I'm Peter Hackus in Washington. The United States Navy, plagued by inflation, budget problems, and the growing need for new ships and planes and other more sophisticated and much more expensive weapons, is having its problems. The United States is becoming ever more dependent on foreign sources for its raw materials. Does the U.S. need a different kind of Navy now to ensure their free transport? Some military experts now question the Navy's future ability to carry out its major wartime task, that is, to keep open the vital sea lanes through which this country conducts its world trade. The question is, reduced both in ships and personnel, how important is the Navy in future U.S. global strategy? What naval challenges will face this country between now and the end of the century? Should the U.S. fleet stay at its present reduced strength? Should it be enlarged? Should it possibly even be reduced? Is the giant nuclear-powered aircraft carrier now obsolete? How does the present U.S. Navy stack up against the Soviet Navy? Welcome to another Public Policy Forum presented by AEI, the American Enterprise Institute, a nonprofit, nonpartisan research and education organization. Today's roundtable topic, the U.S. Navy. What is its future? Appearing on the panel are Senator Patrick Leahy of Vermont. He is a member of the Senate Appropriations Subcommittee on Foreign Operations and a member of the Commission on the Security of Europe. Representative Charles Bennett of Florida. Congressman Bennett, serving in his 15th term in Congress, is chairman of the Sea Power Subcommittee of the House Armed Services Committee. Mr. Bennett is also on the House Subcommittee on Military Facilities and Construction. John Warner served as Navy Secretary from 1972 to 1974. He was Undersecretary for 2 years before that. Mr. Warner was the Department of Defense representative at the Conference on the Law of the Sea and was chief negotiator at a conference which produced a U.S.-Russian agreement on incidents at sea. Captain John Moore, Royal Navy, retired. Captain Moore served in the British Navy for more than 30 years. For most of that time, he was with the Defense Intelligence Staff, concerning himself with Soviet affairs. For 5 years, Captain Moore has been editor of the internationally known military reference book called Jane's Fighting Ships. John Charles Daly is the moderator. Mr. Daly is a former correspondent and commentator for CBS News and a former vice president of ABC News. Now, here is Mr. Daly.
This Public Policy Forum, part of a series presented by the American Enterprise Institute, is concerned with the U.S. Navy and its future. Threaded through all history, ancient and modern, is the critical place command of the seas and oceans has in sustaining nations and civilizations. From Xerxes' defeat at Salamis in 480 B.C., when Persia's fleet was destroyed by the Greeks, through the Elizabethan England victory over the Spanish Armada and Nelson's victory at Trafalgar over the French, to the Coral Sea and Midway in World War II, when American sea power broke the Japanese grip on the far reaches of the Pacific, the command of the seas and oceans has impressed its vital influence on the course of history. Drake breaking the Spanish Armada and Nelson at Trafalgar demonstrated that mass and numbers alone do not victory make. Coral Sea, Midway, and the Battle of the Atlantic against the Nazi submarine demonstrated that superior leadership, seamanship, tactics, technology, and intelligence, supported by industrial capacity, do victory make. The question always has been the mix of man and technology. And our question is, the United States Navy, what is its future? Senator Leahy, weighing today's United States Navy against its mission, do you think the size of the Navy should be increased?
Well, I think that if you define its mission as being able to be available to fight a war in just about every place where the Navy presently exists, simultaneously, No, it's not large enough. But I think that the basic question is still going to be one both for the administration and for the Congress, defining and redefining just what that mission is.
Congressman Bennett, with nearly 30 years in the House, chairmanship of the Sea Power Subcommittee, and holding second rank on the House Armed Services Committee, do you feel that our present naval programs are realistically meeting the future needs of the Navy?
Decidedly not. There are many deficiencies. I would say we certainly need 2 more nuclear carriers. We need cruisers with Aegis on them, the new radar and intercept missile activity. And we need a lot more ships. We need a lot more ships that can be in various places. They have to be small because we can't afford to have all large ships. But the ones I first mentioned are very expensive ships, and we do definitely need them today, even to carry on the fundamentals of our own defense.
Secretary Warner, for more than 5 years as Undersecretary and then Secretary of the Navy, your hand, so to speak, was on the tiller. Are there any alternatives for the future to building an ever larger Navy?
No, absolutely not. So long as we find in the Soviet Union the desire to try and build this fleet that's ever growing to challenge us on the high seas. We also have what is known as a forward defense strategy. I can remember when I went in the Navy in 1944, this nation of ours, which really is an island nation, was ringed with coastal defense batteries, guns pointing out to sea, thinking the enemy would come to our shorelines. Our present defense strategy is such that we are ringed by some 40 allies out here, with whom we must work, we must resupply, and as such we have to have the ships, not only the merchant ships, but the warships, to reach out and help them in the time of need.
Captain Moore, as editor of Jane's Fighting Ships, the acknowledged authority on the world's navies, how would you assess what the role of the U.S. Navy should be in the future?
I think it's very much the same as it has been over the years, over the centuries. And in 1666, in Charles II's time, they put a preamble into the Naval Discipline Act, which we still read today, that it is upon the Navy under the good providence of God that the health, prosperity, and safety of this country chiefly depend. I think that fills the bill.
All right, we already heard some question as to the mission of the United States Navy. With nuclear capability, Mr. Secretary, 200-mile economic exploitation zones offshore, various and arbitrary territorial offshore limits proclaimed, the prospects of mining the ocean floor being now in discussion. Has the mission of the Navy materially changed in this atomic age, and how would you define it?
I think a new mission has really been added, and that's what I call a peacetime mission. Those of us, and I expect all of us, have studied our history, naval history. We think in terms of war, but the United States Navy has, in my judgment, an equally important mission in peace times, and that's providing for the safety of transit throughout the sea lanes of the world for our commerce. This is where I think I disagree with you, Captain Moore.
But what I was saying was that the wealth, health, safety, prosperity, and everything else of the country depended upon the Navy and what it protected. I think this is the same thing. I think that your imports, your exports are vital to the life of this country. The imports are, I think, not sufficiently realized by the inhabitants of this country, how much they depend on the sea lanes. And this I have found in several occasions when I've been talking here. And I couldn't agree with you more. I don't think we're at variance on this. I think we agree.
Well, historically, people think in context of war. The Navy is only needed in the time of war. But in my recollection, since 1946, there have been in excess of 200 incidents, if you'll call them, in which this nation has had to inject, in one way or another, a military presence. And of that 200, better than 2/3 have involved the United States Navy. Mm-hmm. We stop to think perhaps in terms of Korea and Vietnam, but those are only 2 out of over 200 in which our Navy certainly in 2/3 of them, have had to participate.
I do want to undergird something that our fine British friend said to us. He pointed out the necessity of moving commerce, how dependent our country is upon commerce. I'd like to point out that 45% of all the oil that we get into this country for the use of our industry comes by way of ship. Many of our absolutely essential defense materials, such as chrome, magnesium, cobalt, tin, 100% imported. I'm also chairman of the Strategic Stockpile Committee of Congress, and I'm very familiar with the fact that we're in very short supply in our stockpiles, and we do have to import 100% of some of the most vital things to our national defense. And so that undergirds what you've said about the commerce lanes.
Senator, you were the one who raised mission. How do you see the mission changed?
Well, I think that the problem is, and the reason I raised the mission, the problem that we have in the Congress, and it's a problem that's going to affect whatever type of funding the Navy gets, whatever type of acceptance it has in the American people, is some difficulty to get a real definition from the Navy just what that mission is to be. I know last year in serving on the Armed Services Committee before I went over to the Appropriations Committee, we had at one time 4 different navies before us to be considered. All American, I want to quickly add, but somewhat different. We had 2 or 3 of them prior to the Texas primary and 1 afterward. Now, I'm not suggesting that had anything to do with it, with the changes in them, but I would point it out just as give people an idea of where the time sequence was. And we had the question of going, as we perennially have, the Title VIII, that is to make all surface ships nuclear, or all major surface ships nuclear, or just to make some of them and thus be able to have more. Again, we come right down to time and time again, we ask the question, what is the exact mission? Is it primarily a projection of power ashore? Is it primarily maintenance of the sea lanes? What is it? If it's primarily the maintenance of sea lanes, then we do have some significant inadequacies. We certainly would if we had to resupply our NATO forces at a time of war. We could not do so adequately. We'd have enormous losses in going over there. If it's primarily projection of force ashore, then force ashore where? And if it's going to be done by aircraft carriers, can the airplanes that we have, can the type of airplanes we have adequately project against sophisticated defense systems, or are they more attuned to something like in Vietnam where there's far less sophisticated shore defenses?
Could I say something there? The primary function of the Navy is to keep secure the sea lane, which Secretary Warner has referred to in peacetime and also in time of war. In order to do this, there must be some power projection. Now, this has been used as a thing to knock the Navy around and confuse a lot of people about it because they think from those words, and maybe they're not the best words, but they think from those words the Navy's going to run the entire war. But the Navy has power projection needs to get bases on the coastline from which to operate. It must take those bases. It must neutralize the military in that area. You can't just carry the material to the other continent and just stand offshore. You have to take the base. So the power projection in the United States Navy is only ancillary and a part of the one function of the Navy, which is to keep the sea lanes open for the movement of materiel, the movement of personnel, and commerce as it may be. I don't want to use...
But I think, Congressman, and I would certainly defer to your much longer stint on this. You have been on the Armed Services Committee since I was a child, and I certainly defer to your... I mean, before I was old enough to have my paper route, and so I defer to the fact that you've had much longer to look at it. But I have also, however, when I was on the Armed Services Committee, went back and read 10 or 12 years worth of transcripts of what the Navy itself had said each time when they came up. Well, and you'll have to admit when you listen to them that we find time and time again that there's contradictory statements almost from year to year in their own definition of their role, or perhaps I should say in their own emphasis of what part of that role should be emphasized the most, knowing, as everyone does, that whether it's the military or any other agency, as they come before the Congress, there are certain things they're going to get, or a certain amount of the money they request they're going to get, and certain amounts they're not going to get.
One of the reasons why members of Congress are confused about the different pattern that comes to us in Congress is the way in which you arrive at the Navy. First of all, you have a scientific study made within the Navy itself, and advice comes to the Secretary of the Navy. Now, the Secretary of the Navy has constrictions put upon him. He has a budgetary limit. He can only do certain things. He has to do the whole thing within that pattern. And it's very difficult to do. And when you're shaping things that involve $1 billion submarine or $1 billion...
No,
the Trident submarine's $1 billion now.
Trident's $1 billion.
That's right. And $1 billion plus carrier. Almost $2 billion now, Secretary. See, you've been gone a year or two from the Secretary. It's going up.
Come back next year and it'll be more.
Then whether you ask for a carrier or whether you ask for a Trident submarine, this shapes your whole budget. So you have the problem of getting along with the Bureau of the Budget and with the decision by the White House as to how much is going to be allowed in the budget. And then it comes to Congress. And in Congress you find people like myself that don't think it makes sense to build cheap carriers that are not cost effective. I want carriers that are able to do the job, not ones that can't do the job. There's no value in just having something that can't do the job. So I fight for strong ships. And
can I ask a question here, sir?
Yes.
Does this indicate that you are fighting for an all-nuclear propelled carrier?
No, we can't afford it. I think we can only afford 2 more nuclear carriers, and I think we should have them as soon as we possibly can.
I just wanted to...
And I don't even think in cruisers or destroyers we're going to be able to get all nuclear. We just cannot afford it under the budget. We're not going to be allowed that kind of money, so we can't do it. But there's something new happened in the Navy, and this new thing is the fact that the Russian Navy has changed materially. It isn't building a lot more ships. It's going to be a smaller Navy, but it is already a very, very effective Navy. In the last 10 or 15 years, even though they decreased the number of ships they've been building, they are building ships with tremendous firepower. When we get in Congress, we quibble over what kind of a ship we're going to build. They don't quibble about it. They put the very best possible missiles and counter missiles on their ships, and that's what we're confronted with. And it has made a major quantum jump in what has happened with regard to our Navy vis-a-vis theirs. We're not trying to build a carrier for every carrier theirs or a cruiser for every cruiser. But when you realize the potency of the weapons that they have on their ships today, it is something to really give you pause. A lot of things have happened for the first time in history with regard to the Russian Navy. For the first time it has a world presence. For the first time it can shoot down with range missiles that far exceed our missiles. They have a 4,000 mile range missile, which we don't have. They have anti-ship missiles of 400 mile range. They've got all kinds of things which we don't have. A lot of things they have like this which really make you pause as to how we can have an adequate Navy in the future. We just must get ahead with first-class ships.
And doesn't it also make you pause when you're talking about that perhaps we have made a mistake in allowing some of the debate to center, as it often has, around purely numbers or purely tonnage or something like that. I recall last year the Secretary of Defense coming before our Armed Services Committee, the enormous chart, and it said the number of ships in the Soviet Navy is here, and the number of ships in the American Navy is here, based over the last 10 or 15 years, I forgot which. Well, that makes, I mean, you can debunk that, of course, immediately, as we all know, but just look at the fact that one of those Soviet ships that fits in there is a patrol boat about the size that the state police have in my state on one of the lakes, and the other is our 90+ thousand ton aircraft carrier, or vice versa. But what we've done is, I think, and here's the mistake that's been made, and it's partly the fault of the Congress, it's partly fault of administrations, Democratic and Republican, in trying to get this down into a simplistic thing. And you see this effort usually right around budget time. I remember again last year, all the major news magazines, news items and all, would carry these charts. Some of them you'd almost see where they'd erased Department of Defense before they put in with a logo from their own magazine or whatever, and they made absolutely no sense. And I think what it does, it downgrades very much the sophistication of the people in this country who very sincerely do want a strong defense and are willing to pay for it, but are constantly confused by what amounts, in a great extent, by pure rhetoric, sometimes by those of us on the Hill, oftentimes by the national news media after they've gone around interviewing each other and not fully understanding the subject, so they'll use the Pentagon's handout, and oftentimes by the Pentagon.
What a terrible thing to say.
But it's true.
What do you say about the media? Pick on each other. Leave us alone.
I think that in fairness,
We learned it from the media.
having spent 5.5 years in making that march from the Pentagon to the Hill, I want to defend the manner in which the President of the United States, irrespective of party or who he may be, and the Secretary of Defense and the service secretaries, first place, I think they're basically nonpartisan individuals, certainly in the Defense Department. That budget is put up and made up by civil servants who have no interest in politics. Their only interest is for the security and the safety of this nation. And when we go up there and seek to get the funds, I believe that we can back up every fact and have done it in the past.
I would point out before we get too carried away in the total non-political aspect of those who are involved in the Pentagon, I would emphasize that the vast majority of the people I've met there and within the services I found to be exactly as you described. There are a few, however, who I find after being on the Hill, and usually the ones in the front line, after being on the Hill, arguing very much for a particular program for some period of time, it's probably more than coincidence when they move into extremely high-paying jobs in the defense industry that makes that particular program.
Well, that happens in all phases of life.
We're correcting that by new legislation, which I have
Well.
pending and is making some progress.
Yeah, and I happen to agree with it.
I know
and
you've
will
helped
support
on
it.
that. Thank you.
Captain Moore, Janes deals with the realities of fighting ships, and your perspective would be that from far sight, and therefore you have a very broad look at things. With your background of service in the Royal Navy and your intimate knowledge of the navies of the world as the editor of Jane's Fighting Ships, what, in your view, should the size of our naval force be, and what should be emphasized?
The U.S. Navy, I think, is primarily concerned with making sure that the United States is safe. And I don't think that as a result of a whole lot of factors, probably the lack of attention paid to the various programs during the Vietnam situation, that the Navy today is of a sufficient strength to do this job. I think we've got to remember that in both peace and war, this has to be done, that the interests of the country must be protected at all times. And we in Europe, looking back to Big Brother over the water, are occasionally a little disturbed at the attitude which is taken up by certain of the representatives of this country who appear to be almost ignorant of the dependence of this country on what floats on the water, both to it and from it. And so I believe that the safety of this country depends on its imports, its exports, on the physical security of its harbors, the physical security of all those that live there. This can be disrupted in peacetime by various methods of harassment, or it can be absolutely slain in wartime unless the country has adequate means to defend itself.
And you do not find that our Navy in its present posture, in your view, has adequate means to do its job?
Since I became editor of Jane's, which was 5 years ago, the numerical force, and I'm not a great numbers man, but of the major combatants of the Navy has been halved. Now, this was a set program where the old ships were removed so that they didn't absorb the money which should have been put into new ships, which is being put into new ships. But this has suddenly, over a matter of 5 years, reduced the capabilities of the U.S. Navy. And it's only just beginning to move up the curve.
Captain Moore, excuse me, have you finished?
Yes.
I think it's also important to note that we tend to concentrate on the Soviet Navy, but it's my understanding that there's some 48 other navies in the world that either have or have on order, say, missiles. Some 38 other navies have on order or have, not nuclear submarines, but diesel submarines. So they're springing up with this growth of nationalism throughout the world. Many other navies, although small, they could pose a problem.
This is absolutely true. In the 5 years I've been doing this job, I watched with absolute fascination the increase in capability. A country, in some cases, has gone from 2 or 3 Coast Guard vessels to having a complete inventory of minor craft with missiles, which are enormously potent and probably the same potency as the destroyer of the last war. And then suddenly you find them buying 2 submarines. Before you know where you are, they're buying 4 submarines. One little country the other day, I suddenly discovered it bought 6 submarines. Now, what do they want these submarines for?
As a matter of fact, there are catalogs not unlike Sears, Roebuck, and Montgomery Ward, and you can look through them and order a whole array
I've got
of
a whole
things.
shelf full of them at home, yeah.
Do they take an challenge?
So when they deal with the
Can I
United...
enter the numbers game a little bit here so we have something to tie this to? For the last 10 years, the Navy has been telling us what size Navy by way of numbers, and I grant you that you can't just say a particular number without knowing what's in that number. But they have suggested a figure of 600 is what we ought to have. Now that's, we have presently 464. They have estimated that we ought to purchase 30 new combatants per year for the next 5 years. That's a specific program, and it has a mix in it. It's just not an arbitrary number. It has a mix of so many nuclear ships, so many non-nuclear ships, because we can't afford them all nuclear. It has cruisers, destroyers, and it has potency and firepower. But we haven't been getting that. We've been getting more like half of that per year. The Navy did reduce its size in order to get money to build new ships. But regrettably, they have not been allowed to build the new ships. And there's where the problem is. And there are specific numbers you can look at. We do need at least 13 carriers. Our Joint Chiefs of Staff would, I think, if they were at liberty to say, would say we need a few more than that. But anyway, 13 is a good number to say. We're not going to have that at the rate we're now building the carriers. They're not going to be available. It takes a long time to build a carrier. At the rate we're doing now, we're going to be in bad shape, even with regard to carriers in the near future. We're also in bad shape with regard to the nuclear attack submarines. We are some 30 under what we should have there. These are real specific needs to meet our present needs, not some war in the future, but right now. It's true that the Russians have thousands of ships, hundreds of which are not particularly big ships, but believe me, they've got the firepower on them. They can knock down great big ships of ours, and that's part of our problem. They're not resting. They're not little fishing craft. Now, the reason they have small ships is they don't expect to come to our coast. They expect to knock down our big ships with what they have. And some people say a carrier is very vulnerable. Well, it's the most invulnerable thing on Earth. It's protected in every possible way. It's just all kinds of ways to protect it, including its tremendous firepower. And it can project power across the seas, and it can help defend our country. And unless we build these kinds of ships, we are going to be in danger.
Aren't we in a practical matter, though? You speak of 600 ships, however the mix goes. Do you think that by the end of this century we would even approach that, or won't we be much closer to 500, even 22 years from now?
Senator, if we would stop passing things like foreign aid, revenue sharing, and a bill that passed the House the other day, which cost hundreds of millions of dollars to pay for the people that to supplant state government programs for aid to the victims of crime. When we passed the food stamp bill, we never thought about what the bottom line was, how many billions of dollars it would cost. All this stuff about, the B-1 bomber, we got to knock out the B-1 bomber. Somebody say it would cost $100 billion by the year 2000. Well, the food stamps will cost much more than that. But nobody ever cared about how much they're going to cost. They just passed the food stamp program. If we could resist some of these things, which are very attractive, very good, fine piece of legislation, and we subtracted those tremendous things from our treasury, we could finance the defense we need.
No, but back again, and I'll certainly defer to the expertise of the other three members on nuts and bolts and numbers and so forth. But on just the pure politics of the situation, number one, and number two, with the really botched situation that we presently have in shipbuilding capabilities. I mean, we have, by anybody's definition, a really bad situation in shipbuilding capability in this country today. Do you see us reaching 600 of the type of ships you're thinking about by the end of the century?
Well, I do, because I think the American people are going to throw out of Congress the people that vote for all these horribly expensive programs when they realize they're not being adequately defended. I think the time is here. All the polls show it. The American people feel like we're not being adequately defended, and they're 100% correct. 100% correct. And we should stop these programs, which are so attractive because they have a virulent, active minority lobby behind them. We should just say no to them. I've said no to about $150 billion of domestic spending this year. In other words, I voted against about $150 billion of it.
And I know from the polls in my own state, and I come from a very conservative, very Republican state, that one of the things that bothers people very much, that bothers them the most in spending in Vermont, is defense spending. And bothers
Which way
most.
Does it bother them?
Well, Captain, they feel they look at a number of programs that haven't made it, that appear to be overly expensive. They feel that they are not given a clear enough picture of exactly where we stand. I think that there's a great duty on the part of whoever is president, a great duty on the part of the Congress, to have some significant national debates, make available to the American people a lot of the things that we hold classified. We sit there feeling very, very secure and very self-righteous. We can sit with our folders marked top secret, and the only ones who know what's in there, the members sitting around that table in the Congress and everybody in the Kremlin and the Pentagon, but not the American people, are going to pick up the tab and go down on a very objective, point-by-point level, have real debates within the Congress. And I think we owe this country that, and we owe all our NATO allies that kind of open, full, realistic debate. I agree, Congressman, that this is primary matter facing this country. We have an energy crisis, which I think is real and should be discussed. We also have a military, and I think I can safely use the word crisis, it's real. But it's going to be even more of a crisis if we simply say that we will solve it just by spending more money. Say we'll spend X number, whatever percent more in the defense budget. That's not the answer. And I think that we're not looking at what is to be the foreign policy of this country in the future. We do not, for one example, we do not debate defense policy and foreign policy together as a rule, and yet we should, because one really affects the other no matter what, and determine exactly what the United States will do or will not do in the next 25 years, what we are willing to do and what we're not willing to do, and then design our armed forces in that fashion.
I certainly hope that our viewers carry away the following impression. One, that we, the United States, still have the finest Navy and the strongest in the world. Secondly, that the American enterprise system are delivering to the fleets today, use the word botched, but I want to qualify that. They're delivering today the finest warships to be built anywhere. Now, the botching is probably back, and I'll bear some of the responsibility, on the economics and the delivery schedule. But the craftsmen in this country, the brains and the technology, they're the ones that enable us to keep a military lead.
We do have the best Navy in the world today. We do have a situation which may not be entirely solvable. There are many problems in our own lives that are not entirely solvable. We do have a situation with regard to the Russian Navy and its extreme firepower, which we never encountered before. We've never encountered a potential opponent like them, which had the potential of being all over the seas, as they do, and the firepower against our ships. Now, our technology will make breakthroughs like we have in Aegis and our own cruise missiles and things of that type. We've got a fighting chance to be ahead, but we don't have a fighting chance unless we produce good ships.
Captain Moore, could I ask you if we do indeed have the finest and the best Navy in the world in the view of Jane's fighting ships?
Can I just sidestep that question
Yes,
for a
sir.
moment?
I was looking forward to the answer.
The answer will come later, but one thing that John Warner's just said about the standard of the men in the shipyards, I think that one should think just as much of the standard of the men in the ships. I think this is an enormously important part of the whole equation. We do have a little piece at the beginning of the Royal Naval Staff Handbook that says the greatest single factor is the man. I've been brought up on that ever since I could stand, and I believe it is totally and utterly true. I think you will find that the manpower of the United States Navy today is amongst the most professional and dedicated in the world. It's only right that they should be given the best material to work with. And a guy who has given his time and his whole family life, in many cases, to a service career deserves this. And then you compare the standard of the men of the USN with the standard of the men of the Soviet Navy, and you find that you, in this country, are winning all along the line. They're better educated, they're better trained, they're used to technology, and they're dealing with a conscript group who are not of anything near the same standard. So I think that that is a source of some comfort in this overall power equation. I come back to your question, sir. Yes.
Thank you, sir. Now, we very soon will have to go to questions and answers, but we have talked about the Russian Navy, and certainly all of us remember historically what Kaiser Wilhelm I did in building his Navy to set the whole globe on edge, and to a degree the building up of the Soviet Navy is doing it now. Mr. Secretary, you negotiated with and got to know Russian Admiral Gosakov, about whom very little is known, and very few people have had much chance to say what of the character and spirit of the leadership of the Russian Navy?
In 1971, it was determined that this country should send a naval delegation to the Soviet Union to try and reach some agreement which would eliminate what was commonly called in the press chicken at the sea, where the ships were coming very close and the aircraft were making passes, which were dangerous not only to the men who were operating these units, but in some respects to whatever civilians might be nearby. We went to the Soviet Union, and at that time I had the privilege of meeting Admiral Gorshkov, a very interesting figure in naval history. As a part of the summit, the first summit of the United States in the May of 1972, we signed the agreement. And following the summit conference, I had a memorable visit with Admiral Gorshkov, just 3 or 4 of us on his barge, traveling up and down the river there in Moscow. We talked at length. This gentleman was an admiral at the age of 31. In his late 40s, he took over as commander-in-chief of the Soviet Navy, and he's held that position now some 22 years. So he is by far the best-known chief of naval operations by name in the world. And he has literally brought the Soviet Navy from a posture in about 1955 of an ill-trained, ill-equipped, basically coastal defense force to where it is now beginning to challenge, in terms of numbers and firepower, as Congressman Bennett says, challenge the free navies of the world on the high seas. Indeed, a remarkable man. But the secret to him is twofold. In my judgment, we have in our United States Navy 36 Gorshkovs. But we only retain the CNO 4 years, and I think that's proper and should continue. But Admiral Gorshkov had the support of the major political figures in the Soviet Union, and that combination of his genius and the full backing enabled him to bring a Navy into being in a space of less than 25 years.
Could I make a brief comment there? I just recently read a book by Admiral Gorshkov, and here's what he said in it. The flag of the Soviet Navy flies over the oceans of the world today. Sooner or later, the United States will have to understand that it no longer has mastery of the seas.
I think we've raised some questions in our audience, both from the media and among the experts, and that it's time for us to move on to the question and answer session.
The role of the U.S. Navy in meeting international challenges continues to change. As ships get older and are scrapped without replacement, as naval warfare becomes massively more complicated and much more expensive, how can the Navy keep up with its defense assignments? Can the Navy survive in a nuclear war? What new ultra-sophisticated ships and weapons will make up the Navy of the future? Now, to challenge our panel members, let's get the views of the experts in our audience.
All right, may I have the first question, please? Sir?
Sir, I'm Admiral Hill, former Assistant Chief of Naval Operations for Manpower under Secretary Warner. Senator Leahy, as a senator, we've heard a lot about the complexity of U.S. weapon systems that we have to procure for the future. Just what are you doing to make it attractive for young men to join the Navy today and to stay in the Navy to repair and maintain those weapon systems? Simply put, why should a young man join the colors today?
Senator?
I think, and the first reason any young man or woman should join the Navy or Air Force or Army or Marines is first and foremost is going to have to be out of a really deep sense of patriotism, not from an economic sense. I think the services and the Congress have worked pretty hard together to make it economically more attractive, but there's no degree of economics that can adequately compensate, I think, the type of things that the average serviceman or servicewoman is going to have to go through, especially if it's in a time of conflict. But having said that, we do pay, for example, in the Navy, we pay far more sense to the habitable nature of our ships than does, for example, the Soviet Navy. We do have the benefits as well as the drawbacks that go with a non-conscript Navy. But we still have and will always have a great deal of way to go, and it's not just dollars and cents. It's everything from the attitude from the top, that's from the CNO on down through, the skipper of a particular ship, the commander of a particular base. That attitude, the types of rules and regulations involved are substantial. But there's also we have to have a realization that we went through a very, very painful time at the end of the Vietnam War. Doubts not only about the United States itself and its purpose and its missions abroad, but some very serious doubts about the military, and a reflection almost on a peer type of pressure against somebody, a young man or woman who might want to go into the military. I personally feel that's changing, and I hope, for the sake of the country, that it is. And I realize those are very, very broad, generalized statements, Admiral, but they're all part of that picture. It's a lot more than simply putting a dollar and cents figure, even though that dollar and cents figure now makes up, I think, approximately 50%. Is that right, of the Navy's budget? And that's something that we also have to consider because the ratio of people to ships is going to have to come down. It's going to continue to come down, which is a difficult thing in a more technological age. Otherwise, we're also not going to have the money to build the ships that we desperately need.
All right, may I have the next question, please?
Yes, sir. I'm Jim Hessman with Sea Power Magazine. Senator Leahy referred to the shipbuilding process. I'd like to ask him and the other members what, if anything, can be done to improve it. And perhaps Captain Moore could tell us if there's anything we can learn from the Russians to improve ourselves in this area.
I think that the only way that I could answer on that is, one, we know it's existed to the point where some of the major shipbuilding yards or shipyards don't even want Navy contracts, which is certainly a reversal of what we've seen in years past. We know that we can authorize and appropriate for a ship on the Congress, and it might be some substantial time thereafter before it comes off the ways. We can take too long in settling claims. I think sometimes we don't give anywhere near enough discretion. As an old trial lawyer, or young trial lawyer, as the case may be, I know that it's important at some point to give somebody discretion to be able to settle claims.
Mr. Congressman?
I think there's a great deal in what the senator said there, and I would like to point out two things that can happen in the next 2 decades with regard to the Navy that may be helpful. One of them is the similarities of hulls. Instead of starting off with a concept of a ship that has no similarity between another ship that you've built before, many of these hulls can be made, the basic hull can be made the same for ships. So you can start off with constant hulls, constant hull frames. Another thing is that I'm not at all convinced that we won't work into the container type of operation, where we could have segments of things which damaged, we would put another one in. Instead of doing all the repair and everything aboard, you would just take out that segment and place it with another segment, capsulated. I think these are things that we ought to look at. Of course, the major reason why there are overruns in the military is the fact that it takes a long time to build a ship. And if it takes, say, 5 or 6 years to build some of these complicated ships from the time you go on the drawing board till that's a short time for some of them.
Actually 7.
Yeah, and we're moving so fast in technology that by the time the ship gets built that you planned 7 years ago, there are things you have to add. Well, that costs a lot of money, ripping out things, putting new things in, adjusting the space in it and all that sort of thing. This is a very expensive thing to do.
I think all over the world today, really, that designers and builders of ships are up to their necks in alligators. You know, it's it's one of those problems that they have, as you so rightly said, so that we're always getting a new something shoved into a ship at the last minute. We experience this the whole time in the United Kingdom, and as a result, you get a ship that is late, and as a result of being late, it's becoming obsolescent almost before it's commissioned. The Soviet Navy, I think, has an advantage in this insofar as they are driven in a slightly different way. They have continuity to a tremendous degree. Mr. Warner was talking about Gorshkov earlier. I mean, there's that man been sitting in his plushy chair there since 1956. And this is the sort of continuity that means that you're going to get answers. I think that the whole thing is so much based on this continuity. And last year, a man died who had been the chief designer, the chief in charge of the dockyard building programs for Gorshkov. Those two have been working hand in glove since 1954. And, I mean, this is the sort of thing that goes on instead of chaps being whipped away and sent off because it's good for their career.
Is that it? I think that is it. We have another question from this side. Yes, sir.
Rear Admiral Gus Kinnear, Chief of Legislative Affairs.
I would remind you, sir, that the good captain still owes you an answer as to whether we're building the right kind of Navy.
The right kind of Navy is one that is going to do the job that we already set out in 1666, to look after the country. One of the greatest menaces to the country is the submarine. Therefore, I think that we have got to... not we. I keep identifying myself with this country because, you see, one of my forefathers signed a thing called the Declaration of Independence. It's got to be done. We've got to increase. Every single NATO nation has got to increase their anti-submarine capability. They've got to do it by all sorts of means. They've got to increase the number of ships. They've got to increase the capacity of the ships to hold helicopters because, having spent most of my life in the Navy and submarines, the one thing I hate is a helicopter. And I love flying in them, but when I'm under the water, it's a very different question. So I think the answer is coming round to yes, but there's a heck of a long way to go yet. Is that all right?
That all right? Fine. Do we have the next question on this side, please?
I'm Chief Engineman Joe Watson with the Naval Enlisted Reserve Association. I'd like to address the question to Secretary Warner, if I may, and get back to the people issue also, if we may. In the recent past, there has developed a widespread perception of the erosion of entitlements, the breaches of faith, the broken promises, the disillusions with what we thought we were going to get and what we may not get. May I ask, Mr. Secretary, how you feel this portends for the future of our people in the Navy?
Well, in a very serious way, Chief. My recollection is that we served together, and I think you have some 35 years of experience. And when you signed that first enlistment, not only the Navy, but the United States made certain promises to you as an individual, promises that they would carry out when you finished your term of enlistment, whether it be the initial 4 or the subsequent 8 or the 12 or the 20 or the 30. And we as a nation cannot renege on those perfectly valid and understandable contracts that were entered into in good faith with the young men and women who sign up today.
I think most of this agitation and this turbulence about this is because it's unpleasant to read, and therefore it sells ads in magazines and TV. But there isn't much realism to it. The commissaries have not been cut down. As a matter of fact, they are expanding. So, as a matter of fact, the services have improved. They have not been diminished. About the only thing that's been diminished is, in actuality, is something that Congress can't control, which is the medical assistance to retirees and their retiree dependents. That medical service is something that's very difficult to control. Now, of course, it never was in their contract, but it was implied by many people to be there. And the problem there is we just cannot get enough doctors to come into military service.
We have another question from this side. Yes, sir.
I'm Commander Jim Roach from the Office of Secretary of Defense. I'd like to address my question to Captain Moore and Congressman Bennett. What do you see as the principal vulnerabilities of the Soviet Navy over the next 10 to 20 years?
We've got some advantages on them in missiles and anti-missiles that they don't have. And we've got some equipment which is good. Regrettably, not much of it's in existence. Most of it's on blueprint.
I think there are 3 particular things I would pick out. One is their geographical position, which is a weakness. They have got, from every fleet, to get out through gaps. Secondly is their command and control system, where I believe that they are over-commanded and over-controlled. This is possibly part of their national makeup. And thirdly, I don't think their men are up to the standard of what we're used to in our navies, and that's a weakness. Although I think it is wrong to look too closely at the problems of accommodation and feeding. After all, they're chaps who come down from pretty rough old holes up in the Arctic Circle, and they've been used to a sort of sack full of grain and that sort of thing. And you don't expect them to go in and have a choice of 4 hot meals. No, I think the weakness is the training.
Next question.
Gene LaRocque, Rear Admiral, United States Navy, retired, Director of the Center for Defense Information here in Washington. I'd like to ask the members of the panel if they believe it's possible for us to have any sort of extended naval war at sea with the Soviets, fighting only with conventional weapons, or would we be likely to move up to nuclear weapons?
Admiral LaRocque, the answer to that is really a political question. The respective commanding officers of the ships, the fleet commanders, the chief of naval operations, would take their instructions from the President of the United States and who, of course, as you know, would be advised by the chairman of the Joint Staff and the Joint Chiefs. But if your question was, could we maintain a sustained war with the Soviet Union, I certainly think that the United States Navy is capable of doing so, as of today. Our Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Holloway, points out that the trends in our maritime power are down, whereas at the same time the trends in the Soviet maritime power are up. And unless these trends are reversed within a time period of perhaps 5 to 10 years, we could not, that is, the next Chief of Naval Operations or his successor, make the statement or the guarantee to Americans that he can carry out his mission.
Mr. Congressman?
I agree that we could win without going to a nuclear war at sea. I think we could, and I think we would. If that's all the war there was, I think we'd win it. I would like to add one thing, since it's the last time I'll probably have a thing to say on this program. And that is, I hope our audience haven't come to the conclusion we're all people up here championing at the bit to have national defense for national defense purposes, to build a big Navy or big Army or something like that. The bottom line is peace. When I was in college some 40 or 50 years ago, I was a radical pacifist. I really am still a radical pacifist. The reason why I want to have a strong national defense in our country is because I don't want to see a great war occur, or any kind of war occur. And I think history will tell you that if you're well defended, you don't get in any battles.
This public policy forum on the future of the U.S. Navy has brought you the views of 4 experts. It was presented by AEI, the American Enterprise Institute. It is the aim of AEI to clarify issues of the day by presenting many viewpoints, in the hope that by so doing, those who wish to learn about the decision-making process will benefit from such a free exchange of informed and enlightened opinion. I'm Peter Hackus in Washington.
This Public Policy Forum series is created and supplied to this station as a public service by the American Enterprise Institute, Washington, D.C. For a transcript of this program, send $3.75 to the American Enterprise Institute, 1150 17th Street Northwest, Washington, D.C. 20036.